His pacifism led to some of the most beautiful and heart-wrenching pieces of the early days of modernism. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Frank Bridge. Frank Bridge was born in February 1879 in the very south of England to a large family which included 11 siblings and half-siblings. He was a violinist by initial training, and his father was a passionate musician, having abandoned his printing trade in what appeared to be a very interesting midlife crisis. Young Frank gained hands-on experience working with orchestras and small theater ensembles, subbing in on instruments where necessary and even occasionally conducting. He studied at the Royal College of Music under Charles Villiers Stanford, one of the most conservative voices in all of English music, known for his habit of exacting back-breaking lessons on his students, driving many a promising student away from the craft. Bridge didn't just survive Stanford, he thrived in such an environment, although it did put a lid on the kinds of stuff he really wanted to do. The main thing is that it didn't stop him from winning prizes, which is something that probably would have happened to him if he'd been at the Petit Conservatoire of the same era. On the performing front, he switched to the viola. No one really knows why, but it probably had to do with the fact that that was an instrument on the rise, if you will. The first soloists for the instrument were really just coming into their own, and he wanted to get on the ground floor, so to speak. There were a lot of violinists, but not very many violists. Bridge graduated in 1903 and primarily made his living through his instrument, playing in string quartets, and occasionally subbing in as a conductor on short notice because he was really very good at score reading. His failure to establish himself as one of the era's preeminent conductors had a lot to do with the fact that British culture was enamored with foreigners on the conductor's podium. Frank Bridge was just too English of a name for him to get noticed. Also, he really hated the fact that he was often called to sub in on short notice. He could do it, but he wasn't a fan. As a performer alone, he had a grueling schedule that took him all around England. He was in 3 string quartets, regularly performed in orchestras, and often coached ensembles and students at his alma mater. And through all of this, it's a wonder that the man had any time to write a single note down. One of his 3 quartets actually gave the British premiere of Claude Debussy's first and only string quartet. Lacking a professorial position, he could not make his living composing without the funds provided him by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, noted American arts patron of that era. Not having a professor gig was becoming increasingly uncommon, and nowadays it's rare to see a composer without one. This also meant that Bridge only had 1 pupil, but what he lacked in quantity he more than made up for in quality, because that pupil was none other than Benjamin Britten, considered pretty much the seminal British composer of the century. Britten never felt like he could live up to Bridge's standards, and if Bridge held himself to the same standards, it's understandable why he would never establish a studio. After World War I, Bridge was deeply shaken. He was a pacifist through and through, and would often take long walks on sleepless nights, just pondering the bloodshed of it all. His compositional response came in a number of sad elegiac pieces, but none more powerful than his Sole Piano Sonata, dedicated to the memory of his friend Ernest Farrar, one of the many bright musicians cut down in that bloody and thoroughly unnecessary war. After this epic masterwork of torment and despair and soul-searching, his music fundamentally changed, and he began exploring even more novel techniques. It's interesting to note that Britten was a pacifist himself. Perhaps this endeared him during his days as a pupil, or perhaps it's something that he just learned from Bridge. It also became abundantly clear that Bridge and his wife were unable to conceive, and Britten would be the closest thing that Bridge would ever have to a son. He never treated Britten childishly, and in fact, he treated him as his intellectual equal in all matters, and their composition lessons often extended to things that were very much not music, into the realm of art in general, or philosophy, or world affairs. Before Britten set off for America in 1939, Bridge gave him one of his most treasured possessions, his viola. Bridge's pieces aren't often remembered for radicalism, but he was taken with the so-called Impressionists in France, and this manifested itself in very unconventional parallel harmonies, often bordering on atonality, if not being outright atonal. I actually once played a piece by Bridge called Sunset, the 3rd of his collection of 3 poems, which uses as a base sonority during the recapitulation of the main theme a non-functional 7th chord that just comes out of left field. And is beautiful, but technically speaking, it's atonal. It's a technique straight out of Debussy with a chord straight out of Ravel. And this is not to say that he wasn't his own composer, because he was. He was simply borrowing these techniques whether or not he was intending to, because it was part of his development towards his own musical language that would come into its own after World War I. Now, it's unfair to say that World War I was the single catalyst that made him totally change his perspective on music into something that was more radical and more modernist. He was already heading in that direction if you look at the pieces before and during the war. But it's also not really accurate to completely discount the war as a factor, because a lot of his experience is directly embedded into these pieces, especially the piano sonata. Bitonality, i.e. the use of two simultaneous key centers, is a factor in his work, as much as theorists might like to bicker about whether or not it actually exists. In fact, the so-called bridge chord is a major triad, which is superimposed on a minor triad a whole step below. Bitonality a whole tone apart is one of the least grating tricks you can turn if you're using multiple keys at once, but Bridge also threw in a mode mixture. Instead of having C major over B flat major, it's C major over B flat minor. There is quite a bit of difference, even though you're really only changing one note of this bass sonority. As much as Wikipedia might intimate otherwise, this wasn't used exclusively, but it's an example of the kinds of whole-step relationships that he would use. The pieces he produced after the sonata never gained the same kind of attention as the pieces he produced before the sonata, which he found unfortunate because he liked his new stuff. What really made his post-war works stand out is because he stopped writing so many smaller pieces and began focusing on larger pieces, string quartet, or soloist in orchestra, or even the piano sonata itself. The short pieces, like the solo piano pieces, made him money in the pre-war years, but ever since his musical language changed and the publication money dried up, there was no real reason to use this as a way to make money. He went back to performing. Amongst these pieces is a piece called Oration for Cello and Orchestra, which is as explicit an explication of his pacifist philosophy as any text he could have chosen to set. Curiously, he refused to call any of his soloist and orchestra pieces a concerto, which actually doesn't help matters because they often fly under the radar of soloists who are looking for repertoire. A lot of violists, especially in the 20th century, wrote for their instrument as a way to bring it out of the liminal space of being the unloved middle child of the string family. In Bridges' case, it led to greatly idiomatic string writing, especially in the quartets, but almost nothing for the instrument as soloist. In his entire output, there's only about 6 pieces that I can count. They're all short, and that includes an incomplete sonata manuscript. Some of his most popular pieces are, in fact, his organ pieces, despite the fact that he did not know that instrument really much at all. However, there was another composer who lived around the same time named Frederick Bridge, no relation. But that's a video for another time, perhaps. The organ music is used in religious settings, as is his lone choral work called A Prayer. He, like a lot of his contemporaries, lacked overt religiosity, but still were keen to use those elements in their music. The most notable instance of this is in the work of Ralph vaughan Williams, who has some mighty fine additions to the English hymnal despite his agnosticism. Bridge died of heart failure in 1941. His early music not known by many, and his late music not really much at all. And the bloodshed of World War II wiped out what little he had of his reputation. It is through the effort of his pupil Benjamin Britten that his music is known now at all. Since the 1970s, interest in his less accessible pieces have revealed a sound world of great depth of emotion. Like nearly every other composer, he passed away with unfinished work on his desk. In his case, a string symphony intended to be his masterpiece. But what we do have from him is quite a bit, and it's wonderful and moving, and it often explores the depths of human depravity from the serenity of human compassion.